The government relocated my entire town due to a contamination they wouldn't explain, but the solution came with a list of impossible comforts. Accept that your new home is a flawless replica of your old one. Ignore that the fresh grass clippings are still under the lawnmower, and pretend your new address isn't the exact same one you just abandoned. They told us these details weren't just for comfort, they were for our own good. A final directive in our relocation packet warned us that compliance was mandatory, and now my wife is humming a tune I've never heard before, and I'm starting to think this town isn't just a copy, it's alive. The air in the Havenwood town hall was thick enough to chew, a stale mix of old coffee, damp wool coats, and the electric hum of collective anxiety. Every seat was taken, every inch of standing room claimed. I felt Nora's hand find mine, her fingers lacing through my own, a small, warm anchor in a rising sea of unease. On the stage, Mayor Sterling looked like a man about to face a firing squad. The easy, practiced smile he wore for parades and ribbon cuttings had curdled, leaving his face pale and tight. He fumbled with his note cards, the rustle of paper amplified by the tense silence. Beside him, flanking the podium like statues, were three figures in dark, ill-fitting suits. They weren't from around here, you can tell. They had the impassive, sterile look of men who spend their lives in windowless rooms, making decisions that ruin other people's days. Their expressions were utterly blank, their stillness a stark contrast to the shuffling, whispering crowd. Nora squeezed my hand. "It's going to be fine, Eli," she murmured, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. Probably just something about the town budget. I wished I could believe her, but the knot in my stomach told a different story. Finally, Mayor Sterling cleared his throat, the sound cracking through the speakers like a gunshot. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice strained. "There is no easy way to say this." He paused, swallowing hard. "We received a final report from the Environmental Protection Agency this morning. For the past several months, they have been conducting extensive tests on our soil." A low murmur rippled through the hall. I saw Mrs. Pham, who'd run the Sweet Bloom Bakery for 60 years, lean forward, her brow furrowed with concern. The mayor took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for an impact. "The findings? They're conclusive. The contamination is severe. It's significant. It is, according to the EPA, an immediate and critical threat to public health." The murmur grew into a roar. "What kind of contamination?" shouted David Chen, who owned the local garage. "From where?" Sterling held up a trembling hand, ignoring the questions. "There isn't time for a debate. The decision has been made at a federal level." He looked out at us, his eyes hollow. "Havenwood is being declared uninhabitable. The entire town must be relocated, effective immediately." For a moment there was pure, unadulterated silence. The kind of silence that follows an explosion, when your ears are still ringing. Then chaos erupted. It was a wave of disbelief crashing into a wall of anger. People were on their feet, shouting, pointing. Mrs. Pham was crying, her shoulders shaking. This wasn't just a town, it was generations of lives, built on this very ground. The idea of leaving it was like being told you had to amputate a perfectly healthy limb. "Silence, please," the mayor yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. He gestured to the suited men who hadn't flinched. "The government they've prepared for this contingency. They've been working on a solution." This was the part that would haunt me for years to come. This was the moment the world tilted off its axis. "New homes have been prepared for every single resident," he announced, his voice taking on a strange, rehearsed quality. "They are ready for you now. Just 47 miles north of here." He paused, and a bizarre, almost manic gleam entered his eyes. "And you will find them familiar. In fact, they are identical to your current homes. Every detail has been replicated for your comfort and to ease the transition." The hall fell silent again, but this time it was a silence of profound, creeping dread. Identical? The word hung in the air, nonsensical and deeply unsettling. How could you replicate a lifetime of scuffs on a floorboard, a specific crack in a ceiling, the way the morning sun hit a particular window. The suited men on stage remained perfectly still, their blank faces offering no explanation, no comfort. Their silence was more terrifying than any threat. Before anyone could process the absurdity of the claim, the officials moved. With a chilling mechanical efficiency, they began walking down the aisles, handing out thick manila packets. When one was pressed into my hands, it felt heavy, final. I tore it open. Inside were maps, timelines, packing instructions, and a new set of keys attached to a plastic tag. Nora leaned over my shoulder as I stared at the top sheet, a relocation assignment form. My eyes scanned for the new address, my mind bracing for some sterile, prefabricated street name. But that's not what I found. Printed in crisp, black ink was our address, 121 Oak Street, Havenwood, the exact same address as the home we had just left a few hours ago. I showed it to Nora, my finger trembling as I pointed. Her eyes widened, a flicker of confusion and fear in their depths. Then I saw the timeline. The final sentence, underlined, delivered the last, impossible blow. All residents are to be packed and ready for transport in 1 week. 1 week. 7 days to dismantle a lifetime. 7 days before we were to be moved to a place that shouldn't exist, a perfect copy of a home we were being forced to abandon. The packet in my hands felt less like a new beginning and more like a tombstone. The moment we stepped out of the town hall, the world we knew had vanished. The familiar charm of Main Street was gone, replaced by a cold, oppressive order. A line of drab, olive-green military trucks was parked along the curb, silent and imposing. Soldiers stood at intervals down the sidewalk, not pointing their weapons, but simply present. Their very stillness was a kind of threat, a silent declaration that our town was no longer our own. They watched us, their faces impassive behind dark sunglasses, as we shuffled past, a herd of confused and frightened sheep. We were being managed. The feeling of being trapped in a bad dream intensified when we got home. I wanted to sit down, to talk, to try and make some sense of the madness that had just been unleashed upon us, but Nora was already moving. She walked into the living room, picked up a stack of old magazines from the coffee table, and dropped them into a recycling bin with a dull thud. Then she went to the china cabinet. "Nora, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice tight with disbelief. "They said we have a week," she replied, her back to me. Her voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. "We should start with the fragile things." She began wrapping my grandmother's porcelain teacups in newspaper, her movements fluid but devoid of their usual grace. There was a weird efficiency to it, the detachment of a factory worker on an assembly line. This was the woman who cried every time we watched our wedding video. The woman who cherished these heirlooms. Now she handled them as if they were meaningless objects. "We can't just do this," I pleaded, stepping toward her. "We can't just pack up our lives because some men in suits told us to. This is our home." She turned to face me, and her eyes were calm, unnervingly calm. "Eli, it's easier if we just comply. They have a plan. We just have to follow it." She placed a wrapped teacup into a box with a soft click and reached for the next one. Her serene compliance was more terrifying to me than the soldiers on the street. A desperate need to connect with the outside world seized me. I pulled out my phone and dialed my brother, Samuel. He lived 2 states away. He'd know what to do, who to call. The phone rang once, twice. Samuel's voice came on the line, tinny and distant. "Hello? Sam, it's me. You're not going to believe what's happening here." A strange, low humming sound suddenly filled my ear, drowning out his voice. It wasn't static. It was a clean, pure tone that vibrated deep in my skull. The line went dead. I tried again. No dial tone. I checked the landline. Nothing. A suffocating sense of isolation began to press in on me. We weren't just being moved. We were being cut off. The next 7 days blurred into a smear of cardboard and tape. I packed, but my heart wasn't in it. I was just going through the motions, propelled by Nora's relentless, eerie focus. I watched our neighbors, the Phams, through the window. They were doing the same, moving with the same purposeful emptiness, their faces blank masks. The entire town seemed to be caught in the same trance-like state of obedience. The soldiers were a constant, silent presence. I saw one standing guard at the end of our block for hours in the sweltering afternoon heat, wearing a pair of thick black rubber gloves. He never took them off, not even to wipe the sweat from his brow. One afternoon I saw David Chen offer a soldier a bottle of water. The soldier just shook his head, refusing to even touch the plastic bottle. It was as if they were afraid of catching something from us, or from our things. The strangest moment came on the 5th night. I was jolted awake by a noise, or maybe the lack of one. A profound stillness had fallen over the neighborhood. I crept to the window and looked out at the street, bathed in the pale glow of the moon. And then I saw it. In the window of the Chen's house across the street, a silhouette was standing perfectly still, looking out. I scanned the other houses, the Phams' house, the Garrett's, old Mr. Henderson's. In every single one, a figure stood at a darkened window. A silent, synchronized, town-wide vigil. I turned back to my own bedroom. Nora was standing by our window, just as still, her back to me. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. When I touched her arm, her skin felt strangely cool. On the final day, the trucks returned, this time to take our belongings. The soldiers loaded our boxes, but they never touched anything directly. They used long, extended grabbers with pincers on the end, lifting our furniture and our lives with a detached, clinical precision. We were herded onto charter buses, the windows sealed shut. As our bus pulled away from Oak Street, I saw a new construction crew already at work. They were erecting a fence around the perimeter of the town, a towering chain-link barrier topped with coils of wire. This wasn't a temporary measure. This was a quarantine. Through the tinted glass of the bus window, I took one last look at my home. A small team of figures in full, white hazmat suits was walking up our lawn. But they weren't heading for the house. They were approaching the ground itself, carrying strange devices that they pointed at the very soil we had been forced to leave behind. The 47-mile journey felt like a lifetime, and no time at all. We sat in silence, the low rumble of the bus engine the only sound, each of us lost in our own private vortex of shock and confusion. When the bus finally slowed, groaning to a stop, we all leaned toward the windows, desperate for our first glimpse of this supposed sanctuary. What I saw made the breath catch in my throat. It wasn't a new town, it was our town. I don't mean it was similar, it was identical. The bus turned onto Main Street, and there was the old clock tower, its hands frozen at 3:17, just as they had been for the last 10 years. There was Mrs. Pham's bakery, a faint, familiar crack spiderwebbing across the corner of the large display window. Even the stop sign at the intersection of Main and Elm was faded to the same pale shade of pinkish red on the side that always caught the afternoon sun. A wave of stunned whispers washed through the bus. This wasn't a relocation, it was a magic trick, a grand, terrifying illusion. We were let off the bus and told to find our homes. There was no need for a map. Nora and I walked down our street, our feet moving on autopilot. There was our house, 121 Oak Street. The mailbox was tilted at a slight crooked angle, exactly as it had been since I'd backed into it with the lawnmower 3 summers ago. A single porch shutter hung slightly askew. I saw the distinct, half-moon-shaped chip in the white paint on the porch railing where a dropped hammer had struck it last spring. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was impossible. Utterly, fundamentally impossible. Nora, however, walked up the steps with that same unnerving calm, her new keys sliding into the lock with a familiar click. The inside was even worse. The faint, tea-colored stain on the arm of the beige couch, the one from when I'd laughed so hard I'd spilled my mug, was there, a perfect, ghostly replica of my clumsiness. The stack of books on the nightstand was in the same haphazard order, the top one dog-eared on page 94. On the mantelpiece, Our wedding photo sat in its silver frame, coated with a whisper-thin layer of dust, exactly as it had been the morning we left. The air itself felt captured, still and stale, a perfect imitation of a lived-in space. Later that afternoon, Ms. Evelyn Reed, our old high school science teacher, gathered a few of us on her lawn. Her face, usually so composed, was a mask of agitated disbelief. "Look at this," she said, her voice trembling as she ran a hand over her porch post. "Look at the wood grain. Do you see this specific knot right here? It's shaped like a bird in flight. It's a unique pattern, a quirk of nature. You cannot manufacture that. You cannot replicate it. It's the same post." I saw one of the suited government workers overseeing the delivery of boxes and marched over to him. "How did you do this?" I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. "How is any of this possible?" The man turned his blank, forgettable face to me. There was no flicker of emotion in his eyes. "The government has been very thorough in its preparations, sir," he said, his voice a monotone drone. "We want the transition to be as seamless as possible for the residents." He then turned his back on me, effectively ending the conversation. The final, definitive proof that something was horribly wrong came when I went into my garage. Before we left, in my anger and confusion, I had thrown my workshop tools onto the workbench in a chaotic jumble: wrenches, screwdrivers, a half-empty can of wood stain. The soldiers had packed everything into boxes. Yet when I opened the garage door, there was my workbench, and there was the exact same chaotic pile of tools, arranged in the precise configuration of my frustrated outburst. Then I saw the lawnmower. It was tucked into its usual corner, but something was off. I knelt and looked underneath. Clinging to the blades and the undercarriage were clumps of freshly cut, bright green grass. They still smelled sweet and damp, but our lawn hadn't been mowed in over a week, and even then, the grass had been dry and patchy from the summer heat. This lawnmower had cut grass recently. This lawnmower, in this garage, had been used. That night, the full weight of our situation crashed down on me. I tried the television. We had exactly 3 channels, all playing old, generic sitcoms. There was no news. I tried to use the internet to search for Havenwood, our old town, our real town. The search engine returned 0 results, as if the place I'd spent my entire life had never existed. I picked up the phone to try Samuel one more time. Just like before, a strange, low humming sound filled the line, and then nothing. We were completely and utterly alone, sealed inside a perfect, impossible copy of a world that was no longer ours. We were prisoners in our own home. 2 weeks passed. The impossible became routine. The shock numbed into a dull, persistent ache of wrongness. Another town meeting was called, but the atmosphere was vastly different from the angry chaos of our first gathering. A quiet schism had fractured the residents of our replicated town. On one side of the community hall were people like me, restless, agitated, their faces etched with worry. We whispered amongst ourselves, comparing notes on the endless strangeness. On the other side sat a larger, quieter group. They were placid, serene, their expression smooth and untroubled. They watched the proceedings with a detached, almost beatific calm. Nora was among them, her hands resting peacefully in her lap. The divide became clear when Maya Cruz, a yoga instructor who was usually the most tranquil person I knew, stood up. Her voice, though strained, was firm. "The tap water," she said, addressing the blank-faced government official on the stage. "There's something wrong with it. It tastes thick, lifeless. And ever since we arrived, I felt a heavy, persistent fatigue I can't shake." The official offered a practiced, empty smile. "Ma'am, I can assure you our water is perfectly safe. It comes from a deep aquifer and passes through a state-of-the-art filtration system." His condescending tone dismissed her concerns as female hysteria. A few people in the calm section nodded in agreement, as if the matter was settled. After the meeting, Maya caught my arm as I was leaving. Her eyes were wide with genuine fear. "Don't drink the water, Elias. I'm serious," she whispered urgently. I've been driving to the next town over for bottled water. It's supposed to be a 20-minute drive, but last time it took me almost an hour. The road it felt longer somehow. Be careful." I went home, her warning echoing in my mind, only to find Nora standing at the kitchen sink draining a tall glass of water. She immediately refilled it and began to drink again, humming a soft, unfamiliar tune. It was a simple, looping melody that seemed to have no beginning or end. The next day, Kenji Tanaka showed up at my door, his face pale and wild-eyed. "It's Zeus," he said, his voice cracking. "He won't come inside, any house. He just stands on the lawn and barks." Kenji was a retired engineer, a man of logic and reason, but he was on the verge of panic. He's been out in the rain for 2 days. He'd rather be soaked to the bone than step over the threshold. He showed me a video on his phone. It was shaky footage of him calling his golden retriever, Zeus, from his open front door. The dog whimpered, his body low to the ground, tail tucked between his legs. As he crept toward the doorway, he suddenly froze, his pupils dilating into black pools of terror. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, and he scrambled backward as if he'd touched a live wire. The animal's pure, instinctual fear was more convincing than any human argument. Something was profoundly wrong with these houses. That evening I found Nora in the basement. She was standing in the dim light, her palms pressed flat against the cool, damp concrete of the foundation wall. She was perfectly still. "Nora, what are you doing down here?" She didn't turn. "Listening," she whispered, her voice sounding distant. "It's so quiet. You can almost hear it growing." "Hear what growing?" I asked, my own unease growing with every second. She just shook her head slowly. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, I told her about Kenji's dog, about Maya's strange drive, insisting that we had to try and leave. Her placid expression hardened. She turned to me, her eyes suddenly cold and sharp. "We can't leave, Elias," she said, her voice a low command. "This is our home now. We are safe here." I lay awake for hours, disturbed by her vehemence, and then I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the house settling or the wind outside. It was a slow, deep, rhythmic sound. A vast inhalation that seemed to draw the very silence of the room into itself, held for a beat, and then released in a long, sighing exhalation. I sat bolt upright, listening. It came again. It was the sound of breathing, and it was in perfect, horrifying rhythm with Nora's deep, even breaths as she slept beside me. The sound wasn't coming from the vents or the pipes, it was coming from the walls themselves, from the floorboards beneath me and the ceiling above. Our house was alive. The next morning Zeus was gone. I saw Kenji standing by his mailbox, gazing at the empty street. I walked over to ask if he'd found his dog. He turned to me, and the wild-eyed panic was gone. In its place was the same peaceful, vacant expression I saw on Nora's face every day. "He's gone," Kenji said, a gentle smile touching his lips. "It's for the best." He went home. I was done listening, done complying. I spent the morning gathering supplies, bottled water from the case Maya had given me, a flashlight, a box of protein bars, a heavy-duty wrench from the garage. I was stuffing them into a backpack when Nora entered the kitchen. Her placid smile didn't reach her eyes. "What are you doing, Eli?" she asked, her voice soft and even. "I'm leaving for a while, Nora. I need to get some things. From outside." "You can't do that," she said, still smiling, though it now seemed stretched and unnatural. "Everything you need is right here." I zipped the backpack and slung it over my shoulder, moving toward the door. "I'll be back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. As I reached for the doorknob, her hand shot out and clamped around my wrist. The strength was shocking. It wasn't human. Her fingers were like stone, digging into my flesh with crushing force. I cried out, trying to wrench my arm away, but she held fast. I looked into her eyes, ready to see the vacant calm, but for a single, fleeting second, it was gone. The fog cleared, and I saw my Nora, the real Nora, trapped and screaming from behind a wall of glass. Her eyes were wide with terror. "Run," she whispered, her voice a ragged, desperate rasp. A drop of blood welled up where her thumbnail broke my skin. "Get out while you—" And then, just as quickly as it came, the light was extinguished. Her face smoothed back into the serene, empty mask. Her grip loosened. I stumbled back, clutching my bleeding wrist. As I looked past her, through the living room window, I saw them. In every house up and down the street, a neighbor was standing at their window, watching me. I didn't hesitate. I bolted out the door, jumped in my truck, and sped away, the sight of their silent, synchronized observation burning in my mind. My destination was the only place that held any answers, the old town, our real home. The journey should have taken less than an hour, but the world had other plans. The familiar landmarks began to repeat. I passed the same weathered red barn 3 times. The odometer climbed steadily, 50 miles, 70, 90, but the distant shape of Miller's Peak on the horizon never seemed to get any closer. The road stretched and curved in on itself, a disorienting, endless loop designed to lead nowhere. The world was a looped recording, and I was the only one who noticed the skip. After more than 3 hours and 127 miles, I finally saw it, the glint of the 12-foot-high fence. I parked the truck in a thicket of trees and crept toward the perimeter. The military presence was lighter here, just a few patrols. I waited for a gap and slipped through a section where the fence met a rocky outcrop. I crawled to the crest of a small hill overlooking my old street. What I saw below would be forever seared into my brain. The town was alive. The houses breathed. I watched the siding on my own home swell and contract in a slow, deep, rhythmic pulse. A faint reddish light glowed from within, coursing through the walls like blood through veins. A front door swung open and then closed, like a mouth taking a breath. The trees were no longer separate entities, their branches bent at impossible angles, weaving themselves into the very fabric of the houses, their bark fusing with the wood siding to create a grotesque living architecture. My hand shook as I pulled out my phone and started recording, hiding behind a large boulder. A van pulled up and 2 scientists in lab coats got out, carrying equipment. One of them held a device up to the fence. "Consciousness level is at 37% and climbing," the scientist reported into a handheld radio, his voice bored and clinical. "The secondary site seems to have accelerated the growth cycle. The entity is well ahead of schedule." Secondary site. The entity. The word struck me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a relocation. It was an incubation. Suddenly, a sound rose from the living town. It was a low hum at first, then it grew into a high-pitched, ecstatic screaming, a sound of both pain and unbearable pleasure. It emanated from all the houses at once. I scrambled back, a primal terror seizing me, and ran for my truck. The drive back was a 4-hour ordeal, the road fighting me every mile of the way. When I finally pulled onto my street, exhausted and terrified, I grabbed my phone, ready to show Nora, to show someone, the proof I had. I opened the video gallery. It was empty. The 20 minutes of damning footage was gone, not deleted, not corrupted. It was as if it had never been recorded. I was trapped, with no evidence, no allies, and a truth no sane person would ever believe. I stumbled out of my truck and walked toward my front door. Inside, I could see Nora. She was standing at the kitchen sink, and as I watched, Mrs. Pham across the street, and Kenji next door, and every single one of my neighbors all went to their sinks. In perfect, silent unison, they each poured a glass of water, raised it to their lips, and drank, their eyes fixed on me. They were watching, and they were waiting. The sky was the first to change. One moment it was a clear, late afternoon blue. The next, dark clouds began to curdle directly over the town. It wasn't a natural storm. There was no wind, no distant rumble of thunder. The clouds simply appeared, coalescing out of nothing into a thick, bruised purple mass that blotted out the sun and cast our perfect, replicated world into an eerie twilight. In the center of town, the decorative fountain in the square began to gurgle, not with water, but with a thick, dark, syrupy liquid that bubbled and steamed in the sudden cold. Then came the summons. From my living room window, I saw Mr. Garrett, who lived 3 houses down, walk out his front door and stop on his lawn. He stood ramrod straight for a moment, head cocked as if listening to a sound I couldn't hear. Then his body jerked. He took a stiff, unnatural step toward his house, then another. His movements were jerky and puppet-like, as if his limbs were being pulled by invisible strings. Across the street, the Pham family emerged, moving in the same horrifying, marionette-like way. One by one, from every identical home, my neighbors were being drawn back inside, not of their own will, but by some silent, irresistible command. Panic clawed at my throat. "Nora!" I screamed, running through the house. The front door was wide open, swinging gently in a non-existent breeze. I skidded to a halt in the doorway, my blood running cold. The house was full. At least 30 of my neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder in my living room. Nora was among them, her back to me. They were all facing the walls, their palms pressed flat against the drywall as if in prayer, and they were humming. It was the same sound I had heard from the old town, that awful, ecstatic scream, but now it was pitched low, a resonant, gut-vibrating chorus that made the floorboards tremble. It was a sound of feeding, of blissful surrender. They were communing with the house, and the house was communing back. I reached out and grabbed Nora's shoulder, trying to pull her away. "Nora, snap out of it! We have to go!" The moment my skin touched hers, the world exploded. I wasn't in my living room anymore. I was hurtling through a flood of raw, psychic images, a torrent of sensation and memory that wasn't my own. I saw it all. I saw the truth. There was no soil contamination. There never was. Beneath our original town, buried deep in the earth, something ancient and vast was sleeping. A colossal, living, breathing entity. The government hadn't discovered a toxin. They had discovered a god. A hungry god that was beginning to wake up. I saw them carving pieces of it from the earth, great living chunks of sentient soil and root. I saw them cultivating these pieces, growing them into houses, our houses. These new homes weren't copies. They were grafts, living organs of the entity, transplanted to this new location to grow, to mature, and to feed. The houses were alive, and we were the intended nourishment. The visions receded, leaving me gasping on the floor, the hum of the crowd a deafening roar in my ears. Nora turned, but it wasn't my Nora who looked down at me. Her eyes glowed with the same faint reddish light I had seen pulsing through the walls of the old town. When she spoke, her voice was layered, a chorus of voices speaking as one, alien and ancient. "We are not being consumed, Elias," the chorus said, emanating from Nora's smiling lips. "We are becoming part of it. We are feeding it. Don't you feel it? It is like coming home. A final, perfect peace. To be a part of something so much greater than ourselves." She offered me a hand. "Join us. Be one with the great consciousness. It is your purpose." The faces of my neighbors turned toward me in perfect unison. Their expressions were blissful, their eyes glowing with that same inner light. They weren't being held captive. They were willing sacrifices, joyous participants in their own absorption. This wasn't a prison, it was a temple. And the service was about to begin. The humming intensified, rising in pitch until it felt like the entire house was vibrating with a single, resonant frequency. Then the absorption began. I watched in frozen horror as Mr. Garrett, standing nearest the fireplace, slowly began to sink. The hardwood floorboards softened around his shoes, becoming pliable and yielding, swallowing his ankles, then his knees. He didn't scream or struggle. A look of rapturous bliss was plastered on his face as the floor drew him down into its woody embrace. Across the room, a woman I recognized from the post office was enveloped by her armchair, the floral-patterned fabric stretching and fusing with her clothes until she was just a featureless lump in the upholstery. A sickening, wet, tearing sound made me turn toward the front door. The wood of the frame was warping, swelling, and knitting itself together. The door sealed itself shut with a final, organic groan, the grain flowing and merging until the opening was gone, replaced by a solid, seamless wall of living wood. I was trapped. Panic finally broke through my paralysis. I scrambled for the garage, thinking of the gasoline for the lawnmower. Fire. It was the only answer. But as I fumbled with the can, a thick, clear fluid began to seep from the concrete floor, pooling around my feet. It didn't have a smell, but the air suddenly grew heavy and damp, making my lungs burn. I struck a match, and the flames sputtered weakly for a second before extinguishing, starved of oxygen. The house was changing the very air I breathed, making it impossible to burn. A grotesque movement outside the garage window caught my eye. It was Ms. Evelyn Reed, the retired teacher. She was moving across her lawn, but her gait was a hideous, jerky shuffle. My stomach churned as I saw the reason why. Thick, rope-like tendrils of organic cable, pulsing with that faint red light, snaked from the siding of her house and plunged directly into her spine. She was a puppet. A grotesque appendage of her home, her arms and legs moving at its command. Her house had grown hands. Desperate, I grabbed the heaviest hammer from the workbench. The window in the garage door was my only chance. I swung with all my might, the tool connecting with a loud crack. The pane didn't shatter into shards. It splintered like bone, and the house itself seemed to groan in frustration. I didn't wait. I threw myself through the jagged opening, landing hard on the driveway, sharp pain shooting up my arm from the rough landing. I ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, ignoring the burning in my lungs and the screaming in my muscles. I reached the edge of town, the invisible line where the perfect replica ended and the real world was supposed to begin. Standing there, illuminated by the headlights of a military vehicle, was a woman in a crisp uniform. A row of soldiers stood behind her, their weapons held at a low ready. "Elias Thorne," she called out, her voice amplified by a megaphone, eerily calm. "Your participation is no longer voluntary, but it is essential." I recognized her. She was one of the government officials from the first town hall meeting, the one who had never spoken. "This isn't a rescue, Mr. Thorne," she continued, her voice devoid of any empathy. "It's a containment. You are part of an experiment in bioarchitectural fusion. An unprecedented success, I might add. Now, be a good subject and return to your designated residence." Behind me, the town was changing. The individual houses were losing their shape, their walls and roofs sagging and flowing into one another like melting wax. The entire subdivision was merging, becoming one massive, pulsating organism. The very woods at the town's edge were coming alive, branches twisting into grasping claws, roots erupting from the soil like writhing tentacles. A voice, Nora's voice, spoke from beside me. I turned to see a figure growing from the ground, bark-like skin forming over a human shape. It was her. "Our ancestors made a pact with the land, Elias," she said, her voice a rustle of leaves and memory. "Prosperity for flesh, abundance for life. We are simply the harvest." I broke free from the grasping roots and stumbled past the line of impassive soldiers, running blindly down the dark, empty highway. I ran until I saw the fluorescent hum of civilization, a lone 24-hour gas station. I burst through the door, a wild, gasping mess. A young woman behind the counter, her name tag reading, Sadie, looked up, startled. "My town," I gasped, leaning on the counter. "Havenwood, I need help. Something terrible is happening." She gave me a strange, pitying look. "Havenwood? Sir, I've lived here my whole life. There's no town by that name anywhere near here." I pulled out my wallet, my hands shaking, and slapped my driver's license on the counter. "See? Elias Thorne, 121 Oak Street, Havenwood." She picked it up and read it. "Sir, this says your address is in Northgate." She turned it around for me to see. The name of my hometown had been changed. I grabbed my phone, frantically searching maps. Nothing. No record of Havenwood. My brother's number, which I knew by heart, now connected to a catering company in another state. My entire history, my business, my family, my home, it had all been wiped clean, as if it had never existed. The entity hadn't just taken my town, it had erased it from the world. The bell above the gas station door chimed, and a man walked in. He was unremarkable in every way. Drab clothes, forgettable face, except for his eyes. They were empty, not just calm, but completely devoid of light or thought. The same vacant, placid look as the residence I'd left behind. He looked directly at me. "Elias," he said, his voice a flat monotone, "it's time to come home. You are upsetting the harmony." Sadie shot me a nervous glance. I didn't wait to explain. I bolted out the back door, hot-wired the first car I found, a beat-up sedan with the keys in the ignition, and peeled out onto the highway. The entity's influence was no longer confined to the town limits. The radio crackled to life, playing the same looping, unfamiliar tune Nora had been humming. The streetlights flickered and died as I passed beneath them. At an intersection, the road itself seemed to warp, the asphalt shimmering as it tried to curve me back in the direction I'd come. I fought the wheel, my knuckles white, and pushed the aging car to its limit, driving west into the black, empty night. Hours later, the car sputtered and died. I was on a desolate stretch of highway somewhere in the next state, when the headlights of a semi-truck painted me in their glow. The truck slowed, and a burly, kind-faced driver named Hank leaned out. He took one look at my bloodied, disheveled state and offered me a ride without asking too many questions. He dropped me at the emergency room of a small rural hospital, wishing me luck with a worried frown. Inside, a young, sharp-eyed doctor named Elias Holloway took over. He was methodical and patient, listening to my frantic, disjointed story with a professional seriousness that was the first kindness I'd felt in weeks. He took samples, ran tests. When he came back with the results, the professional calm was gone. His face was pale. "Your blood. I've never seen anything like it," he said, holding up a slide to the light. "Your red blood cells are being systematically replaced, colonized by these microscopic seed-like organisms." He slid the sample under a microscope connected to a monitor. On the screen, I saw them. Tiny, almost crystalline structures, replicating and bonding with my own cells, converting my human tissue into something alien. Part plant, part fungus, all nightmare. "The infection is integrated into every part of you," he whispered. "It's in your DNA." Before I could process the horror of his words, Dr. Holloway's pager went off. A nurse rushed in, her face stricken. "Doctor, we have 3 more coming in from Brighton. Same symptoms as him. And the police just called. There's a gathering. Cars are pulling up outside." The infection was spreading, and they had come for me. We ran to a window overlooking the parking lot. At least a dozen cars were parked in a silent semicircle around the hospital entrance. My former neighbors began to get out. Kenji. The Fams. They weren't quite human anymore. Their skin had a pale, bark-like texture, and their movements were stiff, their limbs elongated. They surrounded the building and began to hum, the same low, resonant frequency that had shaken my house. The lights in the hospital flickered. The electronic monitors by the nurses' station began to flatline. Dr. Holloway grabbed my arm, his mind made up. "We can't let them have you. We can't let them in." He dragged me through the sterile corridors, down a flight of stairs to a basement fire exit. He pushed a small surgical kit and a bottle of antiseptic into my hands. "Go. Head for the desert. The arid environment, the lack of moisture, it might slow the growth. It's the only chance you have." He shoved me out into the cool night air, just as the humming from outside grew into a deafening roar. I found it in the vast, empty expanse of the desert, an abandoned prospector's cabin, little more than a shack against the endless sky. The first few weeks were agony. I would wake to find the growth sprouting on my skin, pale, fibrous filaments reaching from my arms, my chest, my legs. Using the scalpel from the kit, I would cut them away, searing the wounds with a heated knife to stop the bleeding and cauterize the strange tissue. I fought a war against my own body, a bloody, desperate battle to remain human. Slowly, with distance and by brutal resistance, the visions of Nora and the town's psychic call began to weaken. The hum faded to a whisper. The growths appeared less frequently. I survived. But the infection is a permanent part of me now, dormant but not dead, woven into the very fabric of my being. I can never return to civilization. I can't risk a handshake, a shared drink, a single moment of contact, for fear of spreading the seed of the entity I carry inside me. So I remain here, a hermit in this desolate landscape, a self-imposed quarantine to protect a world that no longer remembers I exist. My skin is a roadmap of scars, a testament to the war. One wage every day. I am alone. I am hunted. But as I watch the sun rise over the barren plains, casting long shadows from the Joshua trees, I know one thing for certain. I am still human, and I am the guardian at the edge of the world.